Hey guys, well, if the weatherman is right, we are in the last day of our heat wave, and I hope he's right because I'm really getting sick and tired of this. But all these high heat days and heat index and warm temperatures got me thinking, what are the lures that I'm going to throw when we get in the dog days of summer and the water temp gets up here in the 80s? So let's take a minute, I'll show you what I'm going to throw. This time of year, the bass are going to be looking for two things. One, cooler water, and the other, oxygen. So that doesn't mean they're all going to go deep. Some are going to go to deeper water, some are going to stay up shallow. Oxygen is very important to them, so anywhere where you have a lot of vegetation, that's going to not only cool the water a little, but it's going to provide a lot of vegetation. So the first thing I'm going to look for if I'm fishing shallow, especially morning and evenings, you know me, we're going to do top water. If I'm doing top water, I'm doing a frog. Now there's a lot of different lures you can use with top water. You can have a buzz bait, you can have a wake bait, a popper, a whopper plopper, or a frog. But the frog can get into any kind of cover. We have a lot of lily pads here. You get a lot of holes in those lily pads. You can work that frog through there, work that frog around that vegetation where the treble hooks on those other lures are going to get hung up all the time. So if I got number one thing I'm going to go with for top water early and often, it's going to be a frog. If you gave me a second choice and let me put a second one in, it's going to be the whopper plopper. I can take a whopper plopper, run it along the edge of that vegetation, or where I have submerged vegetation where it's maybe a couple feet from the surface, I can run that whopper plopper right over the top, get a little commotion, and bring those fish out to come get it. If you're giving me one, it's going to be the frog. Now, crankbaits. A lot of use for crankbaits in the summer. I guess if they're not shallow, they're going deep, they're going for cooler water. Now it's going to determine what kind of lake do you have. Around here we have what we call sand pits. It's a hole in the ground. They dug a hole, they took the sand out, and they left it, and now it's filled up with water. Almost all of our sand pits here probably are 20, 22, 23 feet deep at the max. But the key is that bottom layer is going to have no oxygen in it. So I'm not going to have fish down there 20 feet deep because there's no oxygen in that water. They're going for cooler water, but they're probably suspending in it. So if I'm going to pick one crankbait for me, I like my Spro's Little John style that I paint. This will get me about 6 to 8 feet deep. I like to use this with fluorocarbon line, so I'll get a little deeper. But this will get me around that 6 to 8 foot mark. If I'm in 5, 6 foot of water, I can bump the bottom a little. If I'm sitting in 10 feet of water, I'm going to stay in just a couple, 2 or 3 feet up off the bottom. Even over deeper water, if you got 15 foot and those bass are suspending, say 10 feet down, I'm going to get down there fairly close to them. So if I have, again, one choice for me, it's going to be this that'll get me down 6 or 8 feet. In your case, you may need a deep diver that's going to go down 20 feet. I don't need that here. Now, again, if you want to give me two choices, if I can have a second crankbait, then what I'm going to go with is a 1.5 square bill. Only goes down about 2 or 3 feet. That'll bring me back up to that vegetation at shallow water. And again, if I have vegetation that's 2 or 3 feet under the surface and fish are sitting in that, I can run that 1.5 over the top, kind of similar to what I was going to do with the whopper plopper, bring those fish up to come get that. But if I had one choice, I like the Spro's Little John style that'll get me about 6 or 8 feet down. That works really good in my lakes that I'm fishing here. Again, number 3, it's got to be for me a jig. I like the 3/8 ounce jig. A lot of guys like heavier. Really, a jig is year-round. I mean, you can fish a jig all year round. It's one of the first things I grab in the spring. It's one of the last things I'm fishing for in November before I call it up for the winter. But a jig will work really well. It works really well this time of year. If I've got some rocky ledges that's coming off a little deeper, I can bounce it down there. A lot of times I'm swimming my jig. I may be throwing off the edge of vegetation. I mentioned in a video the other day, we were out here fishing lily pads, and I was taking a 3/8 ounce jig and dropping it right on the outside edge of the lily pads. getting those fish that are sitting just under there, and they may be down there 4, 5, 6 feet deep. We were probably sitting 7, 8 feet of water. The jig will work really good for that. The next, it's going to be a worm. But in the summertime when it's high heat and we get it like this, I'll fish this worm, but that ain't the worm I'm talking about. I'm talking about a worm. I'm talking about a 10-inch. I'm talking about a 12-inch. I'm talking about big worms. I'll still fish a smaller one, but I really do like my big 10, 12-inch worms. They don't have to be ribbon tails. You can take a 10 or 12-inch and put it in still your straight Senko style. I love the big worms. I love to get them down there deep. Now, I may fish them with a weighted hook, or I may fish them Texas rig, peg it, or let the weight slide, one or the other. Anywhere to get this worm down there deep, and it's almost the same thing. I'm going to take on the outside of the vegetation. I'm going to run it down there just the same way I was doing with the jig. Tree stumps, timber, really Texas rig this and run it around there. Again, I like the weighted hook. I like to use a swim bait weighted hook. I can still run it weedless that way and put a little weight with it. But this time of year, the worm is always good, but when it's hot, that's the time to dig out the big boys. Go get those big worms. This is the time of year they really shine. And if I want to take the worm off, and I don't need something quite as big, I'm going to go with the creature bait. I still like to do the creature baits this time of year. Same situation. If I can't get them to work on a big worm, I'm going to work with a creature bait. That's probably my second opportunity there. This one about 5, 6 inches. This is like a brush hog style. Anything with a lot of appendages, give you some movement. Works real well in case the worm's not working. One last thing I like to carry this time of year, it's going to depend on the kind of lake you're in. The lake we have right here has shad in it. So early evening, late morning, sometimes you'll get the bass chasing those shads up in the schools, and they'll be just erupting all over the surface. And at that point in time, you're going to want something like a shad wrap, flicker shad, rattle trap, anything like this that you can see it and throw it across where the bass are putting those shad up on the surface and pushing the schools up there. You want something like that. So for me, once I get to this time of year, one of these are always tied on. It's always sitting in the back. I may not be fishing it, I may not be throwing it, but I've got it there. So anytime I see the bass pushing the shad up, I can turn around, grab this quick, throw it across, and see if I can pick up an odd fish here or there. That's it, guys. That's what I use when it gets hot. Your lake may be just a little bit of difference, but I'll tell you what, if you got a frog, you got a crankbait, you got a jig, and you're setting up with a worm in some situations, I think you can do yourself about anything you want when we get hot days here in the summer and the water temps get up in the 80s. Thanks for sticking with me. Subscribe to our channel if you would. Hope to see you again real soon.